Andrew was sitting in his living room, warily staring at his laptop screen. It was raining outside the window, the dim light of the lamp lazily spread across the room, as if reflecting his own mood. It was late, and there was still half a day of routine work ahead. He had long been fed up with endless reports, questions from his superiors and meetings on Zoom, where everyone did nothing but pretend that they were really discussing something. Raindrops drummed on the roof of his house with increasing intensity, reminding him that the old slate had been in need of repair for a long time. However, that was the last thing he cared about right now. Night hung outside the window, and darkness tightly enveloped his house, hiding everything around him. Andrew looked down at his exhausted hands, fiddling with the keyboard. All he wanted now was just to forget himself in a dream and wake up in a week when all his problems would disappear on their own. But like everything in his life, his wishes remained unfulfilled. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. Something heavy crashed onto the roof. Andrew jumped on the spot, looking up from his laptop, and looked around nervously. That sound couldn't just be from the rain. His house wasn't new, of course, but it sounded like a whole piece of wood had fallen on the roof, or worse, a meteorite. Gritting his teeth, Andrew got up from his chair, feeling increasingly annoyed. Gloomy scenarios were already forming in his head as the roof collapses, leaving him alone with the rain and the destroyed house. Great, just great, he muttered to himself, going to the window to assess the possible damage. It was dark outside, too dark. Lampposts, barely coping with their task, only slightly illuminated the section of road in front of the house. Andrew couldn't make out exactly what had happened, but the sound was clearly not a figment of his imagination. Then he grabbed an umbrella, threw on a jacket, and, cursing, jumped out. The rain hit his face in icy streams as Andrew stepped out onto the porch. Cursing his fate, he carefully moved along the wall, making his way to the back of the house. The noise on the roof had stopped now, but what he saw made him freeze in place. Right in the middle of his yard neatly, as if it had landed on purpose, there was a strange metal object. It was smooth, shiny, and had an uneven, but clearly thought-out shape resembling some kind of teardrop-shaped apparatus. Andrew did not immediately realize that this was in front of him. Perhaps he simply did not have enough imagination for such strange things. It was some kind of a ship, a miniature spaceship like in science fiction, which he saw only on the screen. Everything looked so incredible that his brain simply refused to digest this picture. But what else could be in the middle of his yard, and even in such a thunderstorm? It was too real. As Andrew slowly approached this ship, he noticed a faint glow coming from a small hatch. He stood in a daze for a couple of moments, not knowing what to do. His logical mind was desperately trying to find some reasonable explanation, but none of the versions seemed plausible. And then the hatch opened a crack. The sound was almost silent, but in the dark it cut through Andrew's nerves. For a moment there was complete silence. Even the rain seemed to be beating the ground choir. And then he saw her. A figure emerged from the hatch. It was almost human in shape, but its outlines were clearly different. The figure was slowly sliding off the ship, as if it was not used to Earth's gravity. At first, Andrew noticed only long, thin limbs and glowing skin, but as he got closer, the details began to appear more clearly. It was something. Not a man, not an animal, something from another. The figure came closer, and that's when Andrew could see her face. She was a woman, or at least resembled a woman, if such creatures could be classified by gender at all. Her skin shone with a bluish light, and her eyes were incredibly large, almost covering half of her face. She looked at him with obvious interest, but not fear. At that moment, Andrew realized that this was not a hallucination, not a dream. An alien stood in front of him. He froze, unable to take a step. Even breathing became difficult. His whole body tensed as if in shock. For a few moments, they just stood in front of each other, looking into each other's eyes, each as if assessing the other. He didn't know what to expect. Perhaps this alien woman will now take out some kind of weapon and vaporize it on the spot. Or it's just a dream, and in a few seconds he'll wake up in his bed, cursing himself for an extra glass of wine before going to bed. But none of this happened. Finally she spoke. Her voice was low, but somehow melodious, as if the sounds of wind and music were mixed.
Are you a local? What is it?
She asked, tilting her head slightly to one side. Andrew froze. Local. His brain hovered for a second, trying to figure out exactly what she meant. After all, it was an alien. How the hell could she speak English? And why was that the strangest question she could ask? He could only exhale.
Yes, I'm a local.
She nodded, as if that was enough for some kind of internal decision.
I'm Zeta, and I'm stuck here.
Zeta, stuck here.
That's all Andrew could digest at that moment. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but his tongue refused to obey. He was standing in front of a real alien.
But beaten TP was beyond his comprehension. At some point, he just gave up before the absurdity of this.
Can you help?
Her voice snapped him out of his trance again. This time, her tone was more insistent.
Help with what?
Andrew finally managed. She pointed to the ship, which still glittered in the darkness of the courtyard, although the light inside had clearly begun to fade.
My ship broke down. I can't leave until I find a way to fix it. And you seem to have the resources.
Andrew blinked, unable to comprehend her words. Resources. Is this a joke? He had a house where, if he was lucky, he would find a couple of tools and an extra toaster. How could he help with the repair of the alien ship?
Resources? I don't have anything like that at home.
He said, trying not to sound like a complete idiot. Zeta looked at him intently, as if assessing whether he was really that useless. She sighed, or at least it sounded like a sigh.
Your technology is not that advanced,
She said, which made Andrew feel like a complete loser.
but it's temporary. I need shelter until I can contact my civilization.
Andrew froze in place.
A shelter. Did she want to stay? In his house? Seriously?
Andrew stood in the doorway of his house, his eyes fixed on Zeta, who gracefully stepped through the threshold. The evening rain continued to make noise outside the windows, creating a kind of background sound that seemed inappropriately ordinary for such an unusual situation. He still couldn't stomach the fact that a real alien had just entered his house, as if this was the norm. His whole being was absorbed in this moment. The way her bluish skin shone with a faint light in the semi-darkness of his living room. The way her large eyes looked around the interior with an expression of strange interest. And the way his own heart was ready to jump out of his chest from nervous tension. She slowly scanned the room, as if analyzing every object. Her movements were smooth and precise, as if her every action had been carefully calculated. She seemed to have adapted to Earth's gravity, but still her gait was a little unnatural. Andrew couldn't help but think about how it was even possible that an alien creature could look so much like a human, but at the same time be completely alien to everything he knew.
Do you live here alone?
Zeta finally said. Her voice was soft, but there was a note of misunderstanding in it, as if it was strange to her that a person could spend his existence in such isolation. Andrew nodded, not knowing what to say. Of course he lived alone. His attempts to build relationships with people always ended in failure. His last dates were so awkward that he preferred to forget about them forever. Working remotely and hardly seeing anyone in person, he was deprived of contact with the outside world. So the idea of hosting an alien in the house was something beyond his comprehension. But here she was, and he just had to put up with it.
Must have. Where will you sleep? What is it?
He asked, trying to turn the conversation to something his brain could handle. Zeta thought about it, looking around the living room. Her eyes rested on the couch, and she tilted her head slightly, as if assessing its comfort.
There will be enough here.
She said, pointing to the soft surface of the sofa, which seemed to her an acceptable place for a night's rest. She said it with such confidence, as if she did not need comfort like earthly beings. Andrew nodded again, feeling his thoughts disintegrate into a million pieces. He would have liked to say that this was a bad idea, that it was better to find something more suitable for her, but the words stuck in his throat. He just didn't know how to behave in such a situation. After all, there had never been any guests in his house, let alone aliens. She sat down on the sofa and made a small gesture with her hand, as if confirming her decision. The sofa creaked under her weight, but she seemed completely comfortable.
Thank you.
She added, sinking back into her strange, almost meditative silence. Andrew didn't know what to do next. He stood as if paralyzed, watching as Zeta seemed to be starting to relax in his house. Everything that was happening seemed like a dream or perhaps a nightmare. How could she even sit quietly on his couch, like this was the most common event in the universe. What's next? Tea and biscuits. However, Zeta's calmness, her pacification, began to affect him in their own way. Strangely, he began to feel his own anxiety gradually go away. This did not mean that his questions had disappeared. On the contrary, there were so many of them that he could barely restrain himself from pelting her with them all at once. But her presence, her equanimity, gave him a strange feeling that everything was happening as it should be. A minute passed, then another. A deep silence reigned in the room. Only the sound of rain outside the windows reminded that the world still exists. At that moment, Andrew noticed that his mind was beginning to sink into a strange stupor. Perhaps it was the effect of shock, but he began to feel that reality was becoming blurred. He sat down opposite her in an old armchair that he had been planning to throw away for a long time, but he never found time for it. There was one single question that had been nagging at him since the moment they met.
Monsieur, why are you here? What is it?
He finally asked, unable to take it anymore. Zeta slowly looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dim light of the lamp.
My ship has crashed.
She said simply, as if it were a matter of course. Andrew nodded, but his interest was not satisfied. That explained why she was on Earth, but it didn't explain why she was sitting in his house acting like it was all planned.
Marta, but why you chose me? Why is my house?
He continued, already feeling how absurd the question itself sounded. Zeta thought for a moment, her eyes focused on him again.
I didn't choose.
She said, saying it with a kind of sad simplicity.
It's an accident. My ship crashed, and your house was the closest place I could find shelter. I have to stay here until I reconnect with my planet.
Andrew felt a certain tension tighten in his chest. An accident. What he considered an incredible, fateful meeting was just a game of chance. She didn't choose him. Her arrival in his life was neither a great destiny nor the will of the cosmos. It was
Malfront. And how long will it take? What is it?
He asked, surprised that he could even ask this question.
A few days. Maybe a week.
She replied without looking up at him, as if she already knew he wouldn't mind. A week with an alien under the same roof. Andrew felt his mind begin to sink back into the ocean of questions. How would he live with her? What will the neighbors say if someone accidentally notices her strange features? What if the government services find her? Or worse, what if her technology turned his house into the epicenter of a space disaster? His thoughts revolved around this impossible situation, but Zeta didn't seem to be bothered. She returned her attention to her surroundings, her gaze slowly moving around the room, as if every object was a novelty to her. Andrew stood up, feeling that he needed to do something to occupy himself and distract himself from the shock. He went into the kitchen, leaving Zeta alone with his old sofa. He needed to collect his thoughts, but in fact he was just looking for a way to escape from the pressure of the situation that had fallen on his head. But as he stood in the kitchen, staring into the empty refrigerator, he realized that nothing would ever be the same. She would stay here, and he would have to put up with it. Andrew tried to calm down, reminding himself that this was temporary, just for a week. But something in the back of his mind suggested that, with her appearance, his whole life had changed dramatically. Zeta was no ordinary guest. Her presence turned everything he knew about the world, about himself, upside down. She didn't just break his usual rhythm of life, she destroyed all the boundaries of what he considered reality. Andrew returned to the living room with a cup of tea, which he made just to keep his hands busy. Zeta was still sitting on the couch, thoughtfully examining something in her palms, some small object that Andrew couldn't see. She looked up at him and, seeing the tea, nodded slightly, as if it were a symbolic recognition of their silent coexistence.
I'll stay here.
She said softly, as if confirming what was already obvious. Andrew nodded, sitting back down in his chair. Now they both had to figure out how to live under the same roof. A human and an alien, two beings who belonged to different worlds. But they had a week to do it. It's been a few days since Zeta moved into Andrew's house. Her stay in his living room, on the couch, had become something of a new routine, and if someone had told him a week ago that he would get used to the presence of an alien in his house, Andrew would have just laughed. But now it has become a strange norm. Her ship was still standing in the middle of his yard, a strange metal object that seemed lifeless as if waiting for the moment when she could fix it. Andrew still avoided being around the thing for too long. Something about its shiny surface made him involuntarily uneasy, but the very fact of her existence was proof that his life had turned upside down. Morning, Andrew was sitting at the kitchen table mechanically stirring oatmeal with a spoon. His gaze was directed at the window, through which he could see the courtyard and the landed flying saucer. As always, he felt a little uneasy thinking that she was still here. But what bothered him the most was their mutual existence in this house. They seemed to coexist peacefully, but the silence that often hung between them was tense, and today that silence was broken. Zeta appeared in the kitchen doorway, her tall figure casting a shadow in the semi-darkness. She moved through the house with a grace that Andrew could not understand, as if she was made to glide smoothly through space. Her movements resembled choreography, but she clearly didn't realize it. She looked at Andrew, and her gaze lingered on the bowl of oatmeal, which he was idly picking at with a spoon.
Are you eating this?
Her voice was low, almost thoughtful. Andrew slowly looked up at her. He was already used to her strange questions, but they still made him feel uncomfortable.
Well, yes.
He replied, clearly not expecting any more. Zeta came closer, her eyes studying the oatmeal with the same interest as if it were a new element on the periodic table. She clearly didn't understand why a person could voluntarily eat something so simple and boring.
No. This nutritious?
Her question sounded more like a statement of fact, but Andrew noticed a note of doubt. He chuckled, shaking the spoon slightly over the bowl.
It's not exactly delicious,
He admitted.
but it's fast and useful.
Zeta seemed to appreciate his answer. She thought for a moment, then carefully touched his plate as if testing its strength. Andrew froze, looking at her fingers, strange but so graceful, and with some almost invisible power that he could not comprehend. Her movements were so strange to him, as if she was doing things a little differently than people did.
These. Our food on the planet is not like that.
She hesitated, trying to find the right words.
Physical. We consume more energy than solids.
Andrew put down his spoon, frowning slightly. This discovery did not surprise him, but he could not imagine how it worked in practice. Energy consumption, is it like connecting a battery to the body?
So you're not eating. What is it?
He asked with a slight puzzlement.
No.
She replied, shaking her head.
But I'm interested in how you do it.
Andrew thought for a moment. Their differences were becoming more and more obvious. Although she looked almost like a human, her habits and understanding of the world clearly went beyond what he was used to. But despite this, she tried to understand him, and strangely enough, he began to appreciate it.
Well, I can show you something else.
He offered, getting up from the table and heading to the cupboard, from where he took out some groceries. Zeta watched with interest as he fiddled with the groceries. Her eyes followed his every move, as if she was studying everything in great detail. Andrew sliced vegetables, took out bread, and put it all on the table in front of her, trying to make the process as easy as possible to understand.
Jill, this is a sandwich.
He said, bringing a plate to her.
We do it when we want to have a quick snack. Taste is not always important. The main thing is...
She tilted her head, examining his creation. Her face expressed slight concern, but she carefully picked up the sandwich in her hands as if it were some delicate scientific object that could disappear at any moment.
What am I supposed to do with him? What is it?
She asked, genuinely not understanding. Andrew froze. He had completely forgotten that Zeta had never eaten anything physical. Her question wasn't a mockery or an attempt to confuse him. She really didn't know how to handle ordinary human food.
You eat it,
he replied, feeling awkward at how absurd his answer sounded.
Might, chew, swallow.
She nodded as if it was logical, although there was still a glint of bewilderment in her eyes. She carefully took a small bite of the sandwich. Andrew watched her reaction, trying to guess how she would. She chewed it with the grace only alien creatures possess, and surprisingly said nothing. Her face did not express disgust or delight. Rather, it was simple curiosity. Zeta carefully put the sandwich on a plate and returned it to Andrew.
An interesting experience,
She concluded.
missing. But I don't think it's for me.
He chuckled. Of course, she didn't eat like humans. That would be too easy.
Yes, That's what I thought.
he said with a touch of sarcasm, but without malice. The next few days were a series of attempts at adaptation, and it was not so easy. Zeta, despite her knowledge of the world, still faced the usual everyday difficulties. She didn't understand human technique at all, and every time she tried to interact with ordinary objects, it ended up being something of a disaster. One day, when Andrew returned from a walk around the neighborhood, he began to leave the house more often to give Zeta some space. He found her in the kitchen, standing in front of the microwave. Her eyes studied the device with a concentrated expression on her face, and Andrew immediately realized that something had gone wrong. She tried to turn it on, but instead she reset the settings and now clearly did not understand what to do.
Were you looking for something? What is it?
He asked cautiously, coming closer. Zeta, without taking her eyes off the microwave, replied,
I've been studying your method of heat treatment of food, but this device behaves strangely.
Andrew suppressed a smile, but it was hard not to grin at the sight of an alien woman trying to figure out a simple household appliance. He gently took her hand and gently pushed her aside.
It's a microwave.
He said, stifling a chuckle.
Nurse. It's not complicated. You just need to know how to set it up.
Zeta watched him closely as he turned on the device and showed him how to select a mode. She nodded, as if she had memorized every detail. But then apparently she realized that she would hardly ever need it. Andrew began to realize that Zeta was trying to adapt to human life, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Her world was much more developed than his. She lived in a reality where physical food was an unnecessary relic, and interaction with objects was limited to mental commands. But she still tried to study in order to better understand how he lives. They both learned from each other. Andrew was trying to understand her world, and she was trying to understand his. One night, as they were sitting together in the living room, no longer trying to digest the next cultural differences, Zeta suddenly asked
Me. And what does it mean for you to be human?
Andrew froze. It was a question that unsettled him. He had never thought about it, had never asked himself such difficult questions.
Must. It's hard to explain.
He began trying to find the words.
It means to have a choice to be free despite all the restrictions, even if they seem impossible.
Zeta nodded as if she understood. Her eyes were full of interest, but this time she didn't ask any more questions. It was clear to both of them that mutual learning continued not only in everyday details. It concerned their essence, what made them different, but at the same time the same in something deep, almost imperceptible. Andrew's house has always been quiet. The loudest thoughts here were echoing in the emptiness of his disappointments, plans that never came true, and dreams that had no place in reality. It was a fortress of solitude that he was almost used to. But everything changed with her arrival. Zeta, an alien, had woven herself into the fabric of his life so imperceptibly that he could no longer imagine his home without her presence. She did not destroy his routine, but only fit into it, like a rare and unusual detail that, it would seem, should not be here, but at the same time perfectly fit into the overall picture. Her soft footsteps, almost weightless, like the whisper of the wind, became part of his daily routine. She moved around the house with such grace that Andrew, initially shocked by her strange alien nature, now couldn't even imagine what life would look like without her. Her presence no longer inspired him with anxiety or fear, on the contrary. Her silent and at the same time silent participation in his life became a kind of anchor for his own wandering thoughts. Sometimes he found himself unable to take his eyes off her when she was sitting quietly on the couch, studying something in silence, or when she was intently looking at the plants outside the window. In the dim light of the evening, when the sunset enveloped the room in soft shadows, Andrew often watched as Zeta sat motionless with her head bowed, examining something invisible in the dark depths of her mind. Her face, slightly illuminated by the orange glare of the sun, seemed unreal, almost as if she was part of the sunset itself, just as ephemeral and mysterious. At these moments, there was something strangely soothing in the air around her, and he couldn't figure out where that feeling was coming from. At first, he thought it was just curiosity. After all, who wouldn't be intrigued by such a strange guest? But as the days passed one after another and their silent coexistence continued, Andrew began to realize that this feeling had already gone beyond mere curiosity. There was something more to her presence. Her movements, her silence, her gaze, all this enveloped him with an inexplicable but increasingly palpable warmth. One night, when the house was completely silent, Andrew woke up to the sound of the wind pounding on the windows. He got out of bed and, deciding to check if everything was in order, went out into the living room. There, in the semi-darkness, Zeta was sitting on the couch. She wasn't sleeping. Her huge eyes stared straight out the window, beyond which the shadows of the trees swirled. Her face was completely calm, and even in the dark, her skin still shone with a soft, almost unearthly light. Andrew stopped in the doorway, just watching her. He felt his heart begin to beat faster, but not from fear. It was something else, a feeling of deep admiration that could not be expressed in words. He couldn't even explain to himself why this was happening. But at that moment, everything that was happening around seemed insignificant. The whole world has narrowed down to one point, to Zeta. She turned her head slowly, noticing his presence. Their eyes met, and time seemed to stand still. Andrew felt his breathing slow down as he looked into her eyes, as deep and bottomless as the universe itself. They weren't just eyes. They were doors to a world that he would never be able to fully understand. But at that moment, it seemed to him that there was some kind of invisible connection between them, something much more important than just living in the same house. Zeta stared at him for a long time, not looking away, as if trying to convey something to him through the silence. Her face remained calm, but there was something new in her gaze, something Andrew couldn't immediately recognize. But he felt it. It was a spark, some elusive but powerful feeling that began to form between them. He took a step forward but stopped, not knowing what to do next. Her eyes were still fixed on him, and there was no need for words in this silence. They both knew that they couldn't say anything that could express what was going on between them. But words were not needed. This moment was their only language, and it spoke for both of them. The next day, something changed. They were no longer just two creatures who lived in the same house, trying to get along. Now there was something more between them, something that could not be explained to either of them. Andrew increasingly found himself thinking that his gaze was drawn to her even in the simplest situation. When they were drinking tea or sitting in the same room in complete silence. Looking at her face, at her hands, at her movements caused him a strange feeling of warmth that spread throughout his body. Sometimes he noticed how she looked at him too. Her glances were brief but full of meaning. She showed no emotion, but Andrew began to realize that her eyes were saying more than her words could have. When their eyes met, something elusive but powerful ran between them, like an electric charge that left traces even after they averted their eyes. Andrew couldn't figure out exactly what he was feeling. It was something new to him, not just an attraction, but something deeper. He felt that Zeta understood him more than any human ever could. She didn't see him the way others saw him. Not a tired office worker, not a lonely man lost in his own dreams and disappointments. She saw his real self. A man with a deep soul that he did not show to the world. One evening, when the sun was already setting over the horizon, they were sitting next to each other on the couch, both immersed in their own thoughts. The room was silent, broken only by the slight hum of the evening wind outside the window. Andrew noticed that Zeta turned her head slightly in his direction, her eyes fixed on him again. He felt it before he saw it. Her presence had become so familiar that he could already feel her gazes without even looking at her. His heart began to beat faster. He didn't understand exactly what was going on, but at that moment, his mind stopped trying to explain everything logic. All that mattered was here and now, her presence next to him, her gaze, which rekindled in him the very spark that had been smoldering for the last few days. Andrew slowly turned his head and met her eyes. Something intangible flared up between them again. Something that could not be expressed in words. It was like lightning running through the air. It couldn't be seen, but it left traces in each of them. They stared at each other for a long time, as if this moment could last forever. And at that moment, he felt that something was changing. Not in their relationship, not in their situation, but in the very air between them. Their looks said everything they couldn't say out loud. Everything they've been through together in recent days. Everything they've learned from each other, it all came together in this one moment. Andrew raised his hand slowly, without fully realizing what he was doing. His fingers touched her arm, and he felt her cool skin. Zeta didn't pull away. She didn't move, didn't look away. Her eyes were still fixed on him, and at that moment Andrew realized that this was the beginning of something more, something that neither of them could predict or explain. The spark between them flared up and continued to burn, no longer fading. They sat side by side, silent, but filled with this inexpressible feeling that connected them. They didn't need words anymore. All that mattered was here, in that silence, in those glances, in that invisible spark that had ignited between them and would never go out. It's been a few weeks since Zeta's arrival in Andrew's life. Their strange but surprisingly harmonious coexistence began to develop into something deeper. They spent more and more time together, and every day a new invisible thread seemed to stretch between them. Andrew, who had previously felt lost in his normal life, suddenly realized that he no longer felt the emptiness that had once been an integral part of his existence. Zeta filled his life not only with her presence, but also with the very idea that he could be a part of something big. Her alien nature, which Andrew initially perceived with awe, now became an integral feature of her being for him, which he accepted without question. He admired her intelligence, her ability to see the world differently, her quiet but obvious wisdom that sometimes shone through in her actions. And although their worlds were different, these differences only reinforced the chemistry that bound them together. But an increasingly disturbing thought appeared inside him. How long can this last? Every day, as they got closer, something elusive grew between them. Something that was more than just a physical attraction. It was an indescribable bond that went beyond the earthly understanding of love and affection. Andrew felt that it was capturing him, attracting him with such force that he could no longer imagine his life without her. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that all this could go on forever, an inner voice told him otherwise. Zeta belonged to another world. This was a fact that could not be denied. No matter how much he enjoyed their time together, her origin remained above his head like a shadow that never disappeared. She was an alien, not just a visitor from another country, but a creature from another reality that he would never be able to fully understand. And this realization, strangely enough, began to weigh on him. One night, as they sat on the porch of his house, watching the stars, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling of inevitability. The stars were as bright as ever, but now they seemed much bigger to him. He knew that somewhere out there, among those millions of lights, was her home. And even though Zeta didn't talk about it, he knew she felt the same way. Their bond, for all its strength, was, in fact, temporary. She was like a crack in time and space that connected them for a moment, but couldn't hold them together forever. Andrew knew that the moment would come when she would leave. It was inevitable, like the sunrise. But no matter how hard he tried to prepare himself for this, he couldn't get rid of the pain that was growing in his chest. He began to look away when their gazes met, trying to hide his feelings. But the truth was, he was already too deep into it. He was too attached to her to just let her go, and it was killing him. The next day, he noticed for the first time that Zeta had become more thoughtful. She no longer spent as much time with him as she used to. Her attention was increasingly focused on her ship, which had been standing in their yard all this time, as a reminder of her temporary nature in this. Every time she went out into the yard, Andrew felt something break inside him. She was leaving, slowly, but inevitably. Her connection to his world was weaker than he would like to admit. And although she didn't talk about it, he felt her leaving, even without words. Every time she touched the hull of her ship, every time her gaze lingered on the sky, he felt that something irresistible was growing between them. It was a distance that could not be shortened by mere desire. He began to stay alone more often, going for long walks, hoping that the fresh air would clear his thoughts. But it didn't help. Every time he returned home, he saw her just as unfathomable, just as far away, despite the fact that she was sitting next to him. It was agony, but he couldn't do anything about it. One evening, when he returned home after a particularly long walk, Zeta was in the garden, sitting next to her ship. She wasn't looking at him, but he felt her presence as always. At that moment, he was overcome by a feeling of utter helplessness. It seemed to him that he was losing control of his life, of what was happening between them. He went to the window and saw her sitting lost in thought, her figure illuminated by the pale light of the moon. This was the moment when he realized that their paths were indeed diverging. She wasn't made for this world. And although they both became part of each other's lives, they belonged to different realities. There was something elusive about her presence, something that was beyond his comprehension. She was like a guest from another dimension who could only stay here for a short moment before returning to where she came from. Several days passed, and the tension between them only grew. Andrew felt it, but couldn't find the words to express his feelings. He didn't know how to tell her that he didn't want her to leave, but maybe it was pointless. Perhaps she already knew that, and maybe she felt the same way, but the reality was stronger than their feelings. One morning when he woke up, he saw that Zeta was no longer in the house. Her place on the couch was empty. He went out into the courtyard and saw her standing in front of her ship, her face turned to the sky. She looked like she was preparing for something that should have happened a long time ago. His heart sank. He knew that this moment had come. She'll leave. Everything had been a foregone conclusion from the very beginning, and now he could only watch it happen. He wanted to stop her, wanted to do something that could change their fate, but deep down he knew that it was impossible. Their bond was destined to last only a short moment, and that moment was coming to an end. Andrew remained standing in the doorway watching as she slowly and restrainedly began to climb the stairs to her ship. Her movements were smooth as always, but there was a finality to them. That was the last time he saw her, the last time she would be here in his world. And so she disappeared through the door of the ship. And a few moments later, there was a soft sound of an engine that awakened all the silence of the courtyard. The ship began to rise from the ground, and Andrew felt his heart tighten even more. He watched the ship rise higher and higher until it disappeared into the night sky, leaving him alone. Andrew stood there, unable to believe what had happened. She's gone. The silence around them seemed even louder than before. This was the emptiness he feared the most. Now she filled his whole world. He returned to the house, feeling the weight of every step. The room where they had spent so much time together now seemed empty and lifeless. Her presence, which had once warmed him, was gone, leaving behind only memories. He sat down on the sofa where she usually sat and closed his eyes, trying to keep in mind the moment when they were together. But no matter how hard he tried, the reality was inexorable. Their bond, no matter how strong, could not overcome the distance between their worlds. It was a gap that couldn't be healed. And although he couldn't get rid of the pain, Andrew knew one thing. They would always be connected even if they were separated by stars. After Zeta left, Andrew's house fell into an unbearable silence. Her presence, which had so naturally woven into his life, suddenly disappeared, leaving behind a void that nothing could fill. Every corner of the house, every room reminded him of the time when she was everything that once seemed ordinary and everyday has now acquired a painful tinge of memories. So life was back to the same routine it had been before her arrival, but everything had changed. Andrew felt lost in this emptiness. The work that he had previously attached at least some importance to had become completely meaningless. He automatically scanned reports, filled out forms, and attended virtual meetings, but his mind was always somewhere far away beyond the screen and walls of his house. Every morning he woke up with the feeling that something important had been lost. Her absence was like a wound that didn't heal, but only got deeper every day. Andrew couldn't get rid of that feeling. More and more often he found himself at the window, looking at the stars in search of the one who had brought her to him. Now the stars, which had once been just bright dots in the sky, had become something much more for him, a connecting thread with someone he could no longer touch. The days and nights merged into one long stream of time, where every moment was filled with thoughts about Zeta. She came to him in dreams, sometimes brightly, sometimes only as a shadow. He saw her face, her huge, inexpressibly deep eyes, her smooth movement, and with each dream, he became more and more aware that her image had become an integral part of his soul. But most of all, he was tormented by the thought that their time was so short, and that this love that arose between them could never be complete. But sometimes, in rare moments of enlightenment, Andrew found solace in the fact that they had met at all. He was aware that this meeting was a miracle. It might never happen, but they both became part of something bigger, something that went beyond the ordinary understanding. The love they experienced was not tied to physical boundaries or time. She was something more powerful than life and death, than the stars and the distance between them. And this feeling, this realization, gradually began to germinate in his heart, like a seed that he had been trying to ignore for a long time. He understood that their relationship was not accidental. She was part of something bigger, something that transcended their worlds. It was like the music that started playing in his head every time he looked at the stars, a melody that he couldn't quite grasp, but that was always there. One night, when the moon was full and the sky was clear, Andrew went out on the porch of his house again. He sat down on the steps, leaning back against the railing, and raised his head to the sky. The stars twinkled above him, cold and distant, but there was something in their light that suddenly reminded him of Zeta more acutely than ever before. He felt his heart tighten with longing again. But this time, along with the pain, came a new feeling, the realization that their bond was still alive. Sitting there under the stars, Andrew suddenly felt that she was still there. Not physically, but somewhere deep inside him, in his heart. He felt her presence so clearly that he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to capture the sensation. It was like a warm wind passing through him, like the breath of something great and immense. It took a few minutes, maybe hours, but time no longer mattered. Andrew was still sitting there, motionless, lost in his thoughts and feelings. He began to realize that their relationship did not end with her passing. This love that originated between them was not related to space or time. She was a part of himself, a part of a soul that would always be with him no matter where she was. Every day this awareness was strengthened. He no longer felt as lost and lonely as he had in the first weeks after she left. He began to see her in everything around him, in the soft light of the morning sun, in the cool breeze that touched his face, in the endless stars that twinkled every night. Zeta was with him, and that feeling gave him the strength to move on. He began to go out more often, returning to what he used to love, but had forgotten during their communication. Andrew began to walk through the surrounding forests, enjoying nature, which has always been a source of inspiration for him. Now, every step, every breath of fresh air reminded him of her, that she had once shown him how to see the world in a different way, with eyes that saw not just physical objects, but their essence. One day, standing on top of a hill overlooking endless fields and forests, Andrew suddenly felt an extraordinary peace. He looked at the horizon where the sky merged with the earth and realized that the world had become different for him. His perception expanded. And even though he will never see Zeta again, their bond will always remain. Andrew began to realize that the love they shared was not dependent on physical presence. She was something that transcended all earthly limitations. It was a love that existed in the very essence of their existence, in their every look, in every movement, in every thought they had ever shared. And even if the stars separated them physically, their hearts were always connected. Several months passed, but the feeling of loss gradually gave way to a feeling of gratitude. Andrew understood that he had been given the incredible. He had experienced a love that was greater than anything he could ever imagine. And although this love could not continue in the traditional sense, it continued to live in him, making him stronger, wiser, and more empathetic. He began to live again, but with a new understanding. Now he saw every day, every moment through the prism of the love he had experienced. She became his constant companion, inspired him, and led him forward. He began to appreciate everything around him more, and every moment reminded him that love is something that cannot be lost if it is real. Andrew often returned to the stars. They have become for him a symbol of a connection that he will never lose. He knew that Zeta was also looking at the same stars wherever she was. And although they could no longer be physically together, their love still lived, crumbling in the light of these distant lights that remained with them forever. Now, Andrew knew that their story would never end. She will live in his heart, in the stars that shine above him, in every day that he lives. And although the distance between their worlds was endless, the love they experienced was as eternal as time itself.